I'm sitting here in beautiful Hurst Landing. You may know it as you drive your way toward Quincy or toward Wenatchee. I have been here many times at a mutual friend's house, and I'm here with Tom Hurst. I've met him at dinner parties and had great conversations about the history of Hurst Landing, and I thought you might be interested in hearing the history as well. So he's invited us to his home. Beautiful place. Thanks for having us here.
Oh, I'm tickled to have you here and share it with you.
Yes, it's so lovely. I've never driven this far down the driveway, so now I get to see this whole other space.
Well, we have a good chunk here of land on the river that we enjoy and think of as a sanctuary for us and others.
It is, definitely. You and I have talked many times at dinner parties and things, and I've heard such amazing stories of your history and the history of Hurst Landing and what brought you here, but I want to share with the audience a little bit about your love of the river growing up in Iowa along the Mississippi and how you wanted to live on the river all of your life if you could. So let's start there a little bit about your childhood and your love of the water.
Well, I was born and raised in Iowa, down in the southeast corner on the Mississippi River. And I had sort of a Huck Finn growing up, playing on the river. It's a very different river. It's wider, lots shallower. The Corps of Engineers, I think, is obligated to dredge it to 9 feet for barge traffic. It's not very clear. It's kind of the muddy Mississippi, like the muddy Missouri. And if there was a moment that perhaps led me here, I can think of myself as a 10-year-old boy standing on the riverbank and watching a small blue seaplane take off the river, climb out to the west. I grew up in a small town. I think the population was, and perhaps still is, like 15,000. And there was lots for a boy to do there. I went to high school there, of course. I graduated in 1956. And not really given a lot of thought as to what I wanted to do, except thinking about that seaplane I'd seen. And from that time on, I wanted to be a pilot. It didn't seem attainable to me. It seemed like so far off. And when I was a sophomore in high school, I would have been probably 16 because I was 17 when I graduated. A man suggested that, why don't you try for the Air Academy? And it had just started, I think, in '55, the first year Air Academy took people, and I got nominated. I took the test. I went to Chanute Air Force Base, and I had no prep for that other than being a high school kid. I passed the test, but I wasn't one of the 6 chosen to go that year. So I'm casting around what to do. Both my dad and my uncle were engineers. My dad was a chemical engineer, as was my uncle, and he worked for the DuPont company there in town. So that was one of my biggest disappointments. What was really my biggest disappointment in life up to that young age. And my mother said, find something that you're good at, you can make a nice living and you can fly for fun. So
good advice.
I think it was good advice, and it stuck with me. Many times I referred back to that. And in those days, I realized that I'm not going to be a pilot, not now anyway. And so what am I going to do? So I decided to go to college, went to Iowa University, enrolled in engineering. The schools then and now are still urging people to go into the sciences and math and those sort of things. And we all had a military obligation.
You felt it within yourselves, each people growing up, or you were obligated to?
No, it was you registered for the draft.
Right.
And you had a minimum 2-year obligation at first. Either you joined the military and typically would be enlisted for 3 years, or you could take your chances with the draft, or you could get a college deferment. But basically, you were either going to do it now or do it later. It was an obligation we all had.
And what year was this?
That was 1956. So they came out in that year with a new Reserve Forces Act, where you had 6 months active duty and then several years of active reserve and inactive reserve, and I enrolled in that. So I was, as a senior, enlisted in the U.S. Army, and I was to go to report to Fort Leonard Wood, Missouri in the middle of July. So between graduation time and July, a classmate and I took a road trip, and his dad helped him buy a '53 Ford, used one, and my dad handed me a credit card for gas, and off we went. And so we went from Iowa down through a southern route, down through Oklahoma, across Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, up to California, up the coast, and Oregon, Washington, and then back through the Montana and the Dakotas, back to Iowa, and I went in the Army. But while we came through the Northwest, Oregon and Washington especially, it just really appealed to me. I loved it. I loved the clear streams. I loved the mountains. I loved the snow caps. Hunting and fishing was known to be good out here. There was water and power. I recognized that was a huge asset for this area. So I went to the Army and went through basic and that sort of thing, and then when I got out, I went to Iowa University, and my goal was to be a mechanical engineer. Well, it took me a year and a half before I realized this was not good for me. I didn't like it. I didn't care for all the math. The tipping point for me was when the assignment for the week was to sit at our drafting table with a slide rule, mind you, and figure out how many yards of concrete it took for the dam on the Iowa River. And I said, this is not for me. I am not going to do this kind of thing the rest of my life. So I knew I had to search and find my calling.
Well, let's take a break. Let's take a break and come back and find out what your calling came to be. We'll be back in just a moment. We're at Hurst Landing with Mr. Tom Hurst. We're here in beautiful Hurst Landing. I'm visiting with Tom Hurst today. He invited us to his property, and we're sharing the story of how Hurst Landing came to be. Thanks again for having us here. So we heard in the beginning of the show how you came to, well, how we're getting to what you considered your calling, which was not drafting or engineering.
Right, right. So as I'm looking around to find a place for me in the world, a friend mentioned chiropractic. He had had an on-the-job injury to his back, was told he was going to have surgery. He went to a chiropractor, and he fully recovered. He didn't have to have the surgery. He says, maybe you should be a chiropractor. So I was thinking about that.
Were there many then?
Not as many as now, probably, but no, it was a relatively new and, I guess, upcoming profession. And so right away I went and visited the chiropractic college in Davenport, Iowa. It was just 80 miles away. It was easy to go looking. And I decided to think about it, but I switched to pre-med courses there's a requirement in many states to have pre-med courses before chiropractic. So I decided, well, I met that requirement. I decided I'll enroll, and if I really don't like it, I'll admit it early on and move on to something else. Well, I had only been there days, and I just was thoroughly engrossed in it, loved it. I could see a future in it, and I loved studying about the body. They
Yeah.
all have one, so know more about how it works and in health and illness. So I went to school year round. I did it in 3 years by doing that. And I didn't know anybody west of the Mississippi, west of Iowa, I'll say. But I wanted to come to Washington, and so I did. I had a '54 Buick.
Were you married yet, or?
I was married,
Married?
had a couple kids.
Mm-hmm.
Eventually had 4.
So you just packed
children.
up the car
So
and
I
moved
packed up the car, everything in
west.
it, on it, shipped one box, a wooden box with some things in it. And
And that was all based on the time you'd spent with your friend driving.
yes, it
And
really
seeing
was based
Washington
on
and Oregon.
seeing it. And wading in the streams. We didn't really fish. We were moving on to sea and country. And I first came out, left the wife and kids in Iowa with their parents, and I had written to 18 different chambers of commerce in Washington once I decided on Washington. And interestingly enough, the best response I got back to my letter was from Wenatchee. The biggest packet appealed to me. It's in the center of the state. And
So you were researching where you wanted to live.
yes.
You
I
wanted to
figured
know what each town was like,
had
what
to
it had to offer.
Some of them, I got to admit that Anacortes looked really good. Cle Elum looked pretty good. Kind of in position to what they had to offer there. But one of my instructors, Harry Andrews was his name. He was from Sumner, Washington. He said, when you find the right town, it'll feel right. He says, like when you put on a jacket that just fits perfectly.
Well, you know, when I was coming through here, my brother lived in Leavenworth, and my son and I had taken a trip, and we started in Los Angeles at my best friend's. It was the summer after my husband passed away. I rented a car, and for 2 months, my son and I, we had a return ticket from Seattle 2 months from when we arrived in LA. And I grew up in Northern California, so we have friends all along the West Coast. And we started in LA, and basically just every day we did what we wanted to do, whether it was go to the beach or Disneyland. I owned an internet company, and I had an assistant who was taking care of most things for me, and I could work from anywhere. And we had 9 stops along the way and ended in Leavenworth at my brother's. And that felt too small for me. And I said, where do I go at 9 o'clock at night to buy a Billy Joel CD? And he's like, well, that's Wenatchee. And I remember driving into Wenatchee and coming into the valley from Leavenworth, and it was like the sky just lit up.
It's like a jewel box.
Yes, and I found a sign for a realtor that day and bought a house 2 days later, and just thought, well, if we don't love it, we'll move back to Texas.
Yes.
But we've loved it. It's one of the best decisions I've ever made in my entire life. So I completely relate that when you find home, no matter what is going on in your life, you know it.
Yeah, it was a feeling. Interesting enough. I suppose having a river run through it
Right.
had something to do with it, for sure.
How many people can say that?
Yeah.
And especially this river.
Yeah, especially this beautiful
This
river.
is a river.
This is 90 feet deep out here.
Yes.
And it's clear.
Yes. So this became home, and you settled in.
So I kind of went to different towns and looked at them and felt them and decided on Wenatchee. And I remember calling home and said, it's going to be Wenatchee. And then I started to look for a place to live. And interestingly enough, when my wife and kids arrived, it was Apple Blossom weekend. And she said, wow, this place is really jumping. Anyway, I guess I'd seen the advertisements, et cetera, about Apple Blossom, but I didn't know how much it entailed.
That's back when they cruised and everything, right?
Oh, yes, yes.
It's a 2-week party.
And so I started practice on July 9th, 1963.
Wow.
It was a slow start. I think I thought if you build it, they'll come.
Yes.
Well, if they don't know you're there,
Yeah.
they won't come. And so as I reached out and got more into the community, I got busier and busier. And by late 1966, I felt able to afford to learn to fly. And I really poured my efforts into that, and within 60 days I had my license. Within 6 months I had my first float plane. It was a Cessna 180 on amphibious floats.
So you didn't want to just afford to learn, you wanted to afford to have your own plane and fly when you at your leisure.
Yes, and adventures. It's very freedom. You get a God's eye view of the world. I think of that anyway, as everything looks wonderful from the air. You can see so much. And adventures north, hunting, fishing. So I had, from that I had 5 different float planes over the 40 years that I had trips north. I really miss it, but every time I think about all of the trips I had and the people that had the opportunity to go along, and each one of those was, they describe it as a trip of a lifetime. So
and you were part of providing that.
Yes.
Let's take a break and we'll come back and talk about Hurst Landing and how it came to be, including the airstrip. Some people don't know that's what that is when they travel by it on their boats in the river. We'll be back in just a moment. We're finishing up our conversation with Tom Hurst right here at Hurst Landing. We're hearing about the story of how you got here. And now I want you to share with everyone what you and I have talked about over visits at different friends' houses along Hurst Landing, how it came to be. And I know the story and that you bought this piece of property from a carpenter who owned it. And I think what you described is it was before riverfront property was where the place to be, the place to build if you could ever afford to.
Yes. The first airplane I had was an amphibian, so you can land on land or water. There's a penalty with that because you have the weight of the landing gear and that sort of thing, and I really wanted to have a plane that just landed on the water. When it's on floats, and you can take it off of floats and put it on wheels and fly it elsewhere, like I flew to Mexico, that sort of thing. I had a patient come in that was a carpenter, and somehow or other he mentioned that he lived on the river. And I asked him, is there a spot down there where I could keep a seaplane? And he said yes, he had a little sandy beach there, and that he would let me use it. And so I bought an airplane on what they call straight floats, no wheels under it, and kept it out here. And when I would come out to go flying, and it was, I'd run into him and I'd say, Bob, how about selling me this place? And
when you say this place, do you mean all of this place?
Yes, it was like more than a half a mile of riverfront.
So it wasn't just the place where the plane was.
No.
The place was the whole place.
The whole place. He had a little house on it. I remember when I went to get a mortgage to buy it from Bob. The banker said, "Why do you want all that land down there?" And I guess I was dreaming big.
Yeah.
I was dreaming big. And so.
Did it take a while for you to convince him to sell it to you?
Oh yes, I think it was a couple years into that. And finally one day he said yes. I didn't quit asking him. And he wanted to go to Idaho. He moved to Idaho.
Has he seen what this became?
No, he's passed away.
Did he get to see it before?
I don't think he ever came back. If he ever came back, I don't know. So I went down to the county and I said, I want to put a dock in for my seaplane. I want to get and they said, well, there's no permit. You want to put a dock in, just go ahead.
That's changed.
Oh yeah, boy, has it changed.
A lot.
And I was, and then in order to change back to wheels, I needed a little airstrip out here. And there was the island that I thought at that time that I owned it. I thought that, it turns out when I got it surveyed, it's state property. But I got a guy down here with a cat, and we built an airstrip, short one, 900-foot airstrip. It's got a little hump in it, a little curve in it, but it it worked to come in and land it on wheels, pick the plane up with a boom, put the floats under it, swing it back over and put it in the water, and you're a water bird for however long you leave the floats on. I built a little marine railway with some mine car wheels and a platform and a winch to pull the plane up out of the water. And progressed through different aircraft through the years, and I was into, you might say, heavy-duty landscaping. I still own a cat backhoe, and so before they raised the river in '79, I got a permit for that, and I modified the shoreline working in the dry, and was able to put this concrete notch down here where I had a seaplane platform to get it out of the water. And I got the idea to work, I guess, maybe toward retirement, to do a subdivision. And I did that, one that's upstream from here that's called Hurst Landing Estates. It's 9 lots. And then, that was in the 80s. And then I got the bug again to do it. In 2004, I started working on Hurst Landing shores. The way it got its name, Hurst Landing, by the way, is the fellow that helped me with the first subdivision. We're looking for names, and he suggested, why don't you just call it Hurst Landing? Well, that appealed to me, and we did that. So this was quite a project, the biggest project I ever did in my life, probably other than my practice, which
What year did you retire from your practice?
I retired 5 years ago. The end of December 31st, 2014.
And you built this house, this cabin.
We built this house in 1975.
So how long had you owned the land when you built it?
It would have been like 5 years.
So your real intention for buying the land at first was to have a place to land the plane, and then build the house to live here, and then developed it as you did.
Built a stable, built a horse arena. I thrive on a project.
Yeah.
I need a project, and you don't get very many. I never got very many opportunities to do something really special, and I felt like that's what I was doing with Hurst Landing Shores.
Well, it's definitely special.
Well,
I spend a lot of time here. Some of the best people I know in this whole community live on this landing along here, whether it's the shores or the estates. So I just love it here.
Well,
and I'm happy to share it with our audience, and so glad that you invited us here to spend the morning. And it doesn't even matter that planes are flying over, because it's kind of part of the story, right?
yes, part of
Usually
the story.
we don't want the noise of planes. But,
well,
thank you so much.
Boss.
Thank you so much for having us and sharing. And I feel like, half an hour isn't enough. So maybe we'll do a whole special about Hurst Landing sometime.
Well, that'd be fun.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome.